you only watch mainstream headlines, you'd probably think America's economy is tanking under President Trump, is what the media is telling you. But beneath the noise of even gas prices, there are massive physical economic developments underway. There's a lot of linear thinking in assuming that because we're in a temporary situation with the current frameworks of things, that it'll just be like this ad infinitum. But it's not the case. And the truth of the physical reality, this is what I'm bringing to you today. So today, I'm joined by Brian Lantz, who is a physical economist, to discuss what's actually happening in the real economy, in the physical economy. When we say physical economy, what do we mean by that?
Yeah, that's a very important question. Physical economy is looking at how we actually reproduce the very existence, our existence and future generations. What are the physical changes we're making on nature for man? Are they sufficient? Do they ensure durable survival, if you will? Not moment to moment, but as I said a moment ago, over generations. And so we're leaving the funny money aside. That's critical. We're leaving the funny money aside. If you look back at 2007, 2008, the financial blowout, which the aftermath of that is what they've lived with. The economists, almost all the economists, didn't see it coming. They had no conception of it because they were just moving numbers around financially, digitally. Likewise, the regulators, bank regulators and so on and so forth, living in this la-la land. And of course, more in real terms, what we're talking about is rising standards of living, rising productivity, which allows for rising standards of living. And we all know that that's not been happening in the past, or we wouldn't have a housing crisis. We wouldn't now be trying to build our way out of an energy crisis in terms of electrical shortages and all that, which was the result of short-sighted thinking. So this is what the Trump administration has taken on. For another view, Bill Gates has used the term physical economy to say we need to transform our physical economy. Of course, he means into a green post-industrial society. Physical economy in terms of the way in which I use it, the way in which Lyndon H. LaRouche developed it, is from the standpoint of developing an industrial, high technology, scientific economy. And all that rests on human creativity. The central source here of development is creativity, not profit.
Got it. So today, are you saying that the schools, universities, touted economists have it wrong? They look at it wrong where it's money first and then everything else comes second. But in the American system, with physical economy, with how Lyndon LaRouche thought of it, Trump and yourself, is that it's actually human ingenuity that comes first and then money second.
Yes. Discoveries of principle, discoveries of scientific principle, of transformation of the social, cultural fabric as well, discoveries in how we organize our cultural life, for example. And that's what's being addressed now. That's what is being addressed by President Trump. So we have the lowest job claims since 1969, jobless claims. We have overall the lowest level of people continuing to receive unemployment. That is, continuing because they haven't found a job, is at the lowest level in 2 years. It's already improving in that regard as well. But it's in construction, manufacturing construction starts. That is the building of new factories, which the rate was 20.2% in the last 12 months, 20.2% in 1 year, growth. That was basically to March 2026, just to be specific. The electrical power and utilities growth, 68.6%. The same year, 12-month period, 68% growth. So this is meant we're growing productive jobs, durable goods jobs, all goods producing jobs up by 40,000%, 40,000 jobs just in March. The machine tools orders are in 2025, we're up 22.5%. Machine tools are what you use to build machines. That it's the essential component of an industrial economy. It's an essential measure. But then even the cutting tools that are affixed to machine tools to power electrically powered CNC machine tools and so forth. They were up phenomenally in the early months of this year, the statistics that we have so far. So that's a measure of how rapidly you're actually using up these tools. Think of drill bits and all that. They're being used up at an incredible rate. So this is the actual growth, the filling out, the rebuilding of the underlying real economy, which means what we call today supply chains and all the rest.
Okay. Wow, that sounds exciting. The numbers gives us a certain indication, but it sounds exciting. You're talking about what kind of effect this would have on the day-to-day culture, the day-to-day livelihoods, and how that will transform qualitatively our quality of life in the United States. One thing, actually, I was looking at the most recent article of yours on Substack. People should definitely visit Brian Lantz's Substack, which I'll have the info immediately for you to click onto. His most latest writing is on the nuclear development in this country, and I thought that was really exciting that Trump from last year had put out an executive order, which nobody really covers as Trump's executive orders, is to have a third 400 gigawatt, which is a third of US's energy capacity, being transferred over into nuclear energy production. So that's exciting. If you'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. It's the adding of 400. Adding 400 gigawatts of power, in this case, nuclear power,
Right.
to the grid. So you're talking about 30-40% increase in the size of the grid. Let's call it 33%. By having that under construction by 2030 thereabouts, completed by no later than 2050. Now that's going to be gearing up because you actually have, as I go through in that piece that you were looking at, as the president's executive orders on nuclear energy from last year has unleashed an overall program and a wave. So starting with micro-reactors, a number of those are going to be going critical by July 4th of this year, celebration of 250th anniversary. They set that as a goal. So you have a number of companies that are vying to be there, to be going critical, power critical, if you will, providing energy, and not to the grid per se, but ready to then make that step by July 4th. So you have micro-reactors, and that starts in the defense sector, space-related applications for obvious reasons. You can't depend on solar energy on the moon. So micro-reactors, and then the small modular reactors, the construction of the first advanced Generation 4 small modular reactor has its construction permit. That's in Kermer.
Just to touch,
Wyoming.
You and I understand the solar question and the green question.
Yeah.
Just to clarify that, why that's laughable for U.S. policy to actually build solar under Obama, Biden. The energy flux density, which is a term that's used by LaRouche, if we look at how much energy we put into the production process of solar versus nuclear. Solar power, you cannot run a country on solar power by any means. Solar power, you never be a sufficient amount of energy with a low grade energy production. To put the facts out on this.
Yes.
I thought it was really interesting, Brian. Also, and this is the deals that Trump are making with other nations like South Korea, who will be playing a role into either aiding in the United States in building the nuclear power reactors.
Yes, yeah. And this is the new state-to-state relations that's replacing globalization. Globalization that essentially turned every nation into a have-not nation. No nation is able to produce what it needs. Just like the United States, we have to import so much because we stopped producing. Every country basically was convinced by the quote unquote market, the manipulated City of London, Wall Street control of markets, globalized markets for energy and raw materials and everything else, that you had to specialize only in those things that you could compete with other countries in. And therefore basically shut down everything else and simply buy it because you can buy it cheaper than you can produce it. It's like a Walmart economy. It's nuts. Now you have South Korea, Japan, major 500 billion, in the case of Japan, investments into the United States, 500 billion plus, 350 total coming in from South Korea for shipbuilding as well as for nuclear reactors. And that's technology transfer. They're transferring technology that they have, they're in advance of us in those areas, to the United States to aid in the redevelopment. And that means future markets for them. So it's a win-win, if you will.
Do you think that currently in the United States, with the potential of all these new fields, is the problem right now we actually don't have enough skilled workers, particularly amongst the younger adult generation entering the workforce? Do you see that as a barrier that has to be overcome right now? Because I'm in California,
Yeah.
and we deal with California politics. And I think employees who are in the blue collar industry in California can mix up California policies from the United States. From what you're reporting on, all the developments that are happening with shipbuilding in Pennsylvania, I know aluminum, copper mills and factories being brought back up. If I travel to these states, Pennsylvania to certain southern states, that these industries are being built in, do you
Mm-hmm.
see a complete difference in effect right now if I were to travel to these states?
Well, I think you see that. Look at the election results and what is now the last 24 hours, the election results in Kentucky, Cassidy being dumped in Louisiana, the Senator Cassidy, Massey in Kentucky, and so on. There's, what often gets called the rhinos are being dumped. More, there's an insurgent sense of optimism that's taking hold in the country that we can fundamentally change and are changing the direction. So yes, there's labor shortages, but they can be overcome. I mean, right now, states, particularly obviously more red states than blue states, but everybody's tending to catch on, are spending money at the community college level, trade school level, et cetera, to up the game, to train more workers, young workers, and reskill, upskill the existing workforce to meet these shortages because the demand is there. These are higher wage jobs. If it attracts industry to their states, then that means more tax dollars, more revenue, tax revenue, for the state to meet fundamental needs. So it's, again, in their interests. And so this has really been carrying forward, expanding really since the end of COVID, but it's taken off under the Trump administration. So it's being addressed. Is it being addressed rapidly? Well, enough. We're digging ourselves out of a deep hole. This was not just Biden, Sleepy Joe, and, the auto pen and all that. This stretches back over decades. You can take it back to 71 when the dollar went off the gold standard. That's another topic. But the point is, we begin to become a post-industrial country. That was seen as a good thing. Now we're realizing that that's why the lights are going out, so we're addressing it. But, but it's we're building ourselves out of a deep hole.
As we should be
Yes.
immediately. So we talked about energy development in this country and the variety of data that you just told us about, the upshift in the economy. Is what specific sector we should pay attention to your knowledge and expertise, the media isn't covered at all in the United States or will be happening in the United States in the next year or two?
Well, the ones that are making the changes on nature for man can't do that without energy. So the build out of additional power, baseload power, 24/7 power, not windmills and solar that produce power maybe 30% of the time max. Steel production. We're now the third largest steel producer in the world. We haven't been there for decades. Already because of the tariff policies, we're producing more steel. Energy, I mentioned, manufacturing. And that includes the chemical industry, areas that people may not think about as manufacturing, but the chemical industries, which are used in all kinds of ways. I think those are singular, along with a shift in the workforce. We've had somewhere in the hundreds of thousands, I don't have the figure in front of me, federal workforce have now retired, resigned, moved on in the last 12 months or so. At the same time, the private sector is picking up those employees. Are we shifting a growing proportion of our workforce back into producer jobs? Are we shifting out of services overhead by essentially definition? It's the back office. Are we shifting people out of the back office, out of hotel and other hospitality jobs,
Right.
into production, which are better paying jobs? They have futures. They have careers in front of them. Are we doing that? That's going to be that's a critical measure. We're starting to move in that direction. That's what we also see with all these young men and women who are joining the skills trades, are becoming apprenticeships, working towards their journeyman positions and so forth, is that process.
Now, you just recently wrote a piece on AI too, and with the technological advancements today. But you don't think that AI, which is the kind of fear that people have right now, that AI is not going to replace jobs. AI will play a role, but that we're going to see an increase of a need for more physical labor, more job production increase.
Yes. Work, as you can cite the Bible, the Old Testament, so it's shared by the Abrahamic religions. Work is a gift from God. Work is a purpose. It is purposeful. And the human mind does things that no computer ever can do. A computer is essentially linear, a term you used a little bit earlier. It can only generate from what it already knows, whatever already has been fed into it. It can recombine it, but it doesn't generate new knowledge, discovery of new principles. So this is where man always is in the forefront. Creativity is not just a scientist. It's not just a Beethoven. It's on through the productive economy. You develop a new prototype, you apply it. Well, working it out on the assembly line involves creativity. The men and women who are engaging with that new capability are problem solving and coming up with new applications. So none of that's in the computer. None, so more and more people are going to be needed as creative people as we grow our division of labor, as we grow our economy, as a productive, economy, which, as you said, meets human needs, the human requirements.
Right. That's always been, even from when in the late 1800s, when steam power and electricity was being invented and then apply it, people were always the kind of fear, the kind of maybe irrational fear around it. Oh man, the exciting thing to hear about all the energy development that is going on and that we need when we talk about something like adding 400 megawatts. What does that mean? It means
400
new industry.
gigawatts. 400 gigawatts.
Gigawatts. 400 gigawatts. That means new industries, right? New manufacturing capabilities. It means potentially high speed rail for the United States. It means new towns, new cities, new communities that young adults can start families in, right? It means new jobs, high paying jobs, that tariffs, right, would actually be part of protecting these high paying jobs so that a family with just one income can take care of, a family of 2 to 3 or however
Mhm.
much
We
people
we
want. I mean,
it's a,
I'm just trying to thinking that through, because if you have a cynical mindset and you're saying, oh, add 400 gigawatts of energy, what does that mean? Does that mean people just, be on the internet staring at the screens more? Right?
yeah. The opposite. We'll have less and less time to mess with our own minds
Yeah.
on social media, black pill
Right.
ourselves. We get away from that. Yeah, and houses. Look, we produce tens of millions of houses. Single family homes right after World War II. We did it even starting before the end of World War II. The National Home Loan Board, it still exists. If we have the tax revenue base growing again in this country, a solid growing economy, we can spin off. We'll have the surplus to invest in that kind of expansion of housing construction in the short term. It could come in the immediate years of the Trump administration as the second term and beyond, of course, as well. But all of these shortages that people feel very personally are in the process of being addressed. The final thing I'd say on that is just, if you're on an airplane and the message comes on that the plane's in trouble and the oxygen masks drop down, you're requested, if you're with a child, to put your mask on yourself first and then to put it on your child. Because if you don't survive, it's very unlikely your child will survive under those circumstances. So that's what we're doing. We're building ourselves out of a hole. We're expanding the economy. People can look around and see it. We're growing our resources and wealth of the nation. With that, then we can take care of our children and grandchildren. So that's what I think I would conclude with.
Okay, from just myself digging into this some more, I thought I knew somewhat. I keep abreast of things, especially with Promethean Action.
Mm-hmm.
Brian Lantz also is a contributor at Promethean Action. Is that President Trump understands this pretty personally, given his background of being a builder in New York City. When he says this question of tariffs is the most beautiful word to him in the English dictionary. I actually understand that now from digging into the history, speaking with you, speaking with Bob Ingram, in actually understanding conceptually what the role of tariffs play and how it will completely just transform qualitatively the United States. And that's exciting. I'm going to cut this part. I did not want to speak after you, but I'll give you the last 1 minute or two to actually conclude this wonderful interview. And thank you for your time.
Well, the American system is back. That's days from Franklin and Washington and Hamilton. Our nation has always been inspired by great leaders. They're men and women of action. That's who we look up to. Sometimes it's a scientist. Sometimes it's like a Donald Trump. It's the person that stands against the storm, that sees their way through the storm. It's the firemen, it's the policemen as well that put themselves in harm's way. Our soldiers, our men and women in the armed services. This is the wellspring of the American system. It's not capitalism. It's definitely not socialism. It is the American system where there is a fundamental positive role for government to play, to shape the direction, the purposefulness of economic activity for future, with the idea of future generations in mind. And it's back.
Okay, thank you for that, Brian Lantz. It has been a pleasure talking to you, and I'm definitely going to have Brian Lantz back in discussion in the near future. So, thank you for watching. If you
enjoyed it,
great. The viewers, if you've gotten something out of this, if you've learned something that if we brought up something that you've not thought about in this way before, back us up, subscribe to Promethean Action, subscribe to my channel. I will continue on with bringing you this kind of optimistic, truthful outlook. So take care, everybody. We'll see you again.